Hi, I'm Tom, and welcome back to Cannabis Legalization News, the channel where we cut through the haze and give it to you straight about cannabis law and policy. I'm a cannabis lawyer who's been watching this slow motion train wreck for more than a decade. And let me tell you, if you are waiting for Congress or the DEA to swoop in and legalize cannabis at the federal level, you might want to get comfortable, real comfortable. Like, put your feet up. It's why I'm here in my office's consumption lounge, because even now, in April 2025, we're still stuck in the same purgatory we have been in for years. And hemp looks like it's going back to being just rope. So it's probably going to get worse unless you consider big alcohol owning the cannabis industry progress. I don't. So hit subscribe if you're new here and like the video to get the message out. And now let's talk some real facts. Marijuana has been illegal for decades and has been steeped in politics for so long that you could read stuff from like the 1970s and it sounds like you could have said it today. For example, in 1971, Carl Sagan said, "The illegality of cannabis is outrageous, an impediment to full utilization of a drug which helps produce the serenity and insight, sensitivity, and fellowship so desperately needed in this increasingly mad and dangerous world." That sounds like something you'd hear us say on the podcast last week. But you'd think that after over 50 years, we would have made some progress. But things can go back and forth. Here's an example. You know what swept across the land in the 1970s before going dead in its tracks for 20 years? Marijuana decriminalization efforts. And this happened way before people had ever heard of THCA. Now, in 2025, most states are legal for medical cannabis. Some of those programs are great, some need work. And the same with the 24 states that have legalized it for adults. And despite all that, cannabis is still a Schedule 1 substance under our federal law. That's right. According to the DEA, the cannabis has the same level of abuse potential and no accepted medical use as heroin or LSD. That kind of classification did not make sense back in 1971 when the Controlled Substances Act was passed, but today it's just embarrassing. And after 50 years, it seemed like we might be getting some change. Back in 2022, during the Biden administration, we saw a glimmer of hope. Health and Human Services, the same agency that previously held the line on no medical value, made a historic recommendation to move cannabis to Schedule 3. That was a big deal, or a stunt to get votes for the midterms. Either way, it was the first time a federal agency formally acknowledged that cannabis has some therapeutic value. Wild, right? But the Controlled Substances Act isn't a one step process. Even if HHS says, hey, maybe cannabis is okay medically, the DEA is the final word. And during Trump's first term, the DEA rejected every single attempt to move cannabis off of Schedule 1. And guess what? He's back in office. And so far, the DEA has not changed its stance, but Trump has brought back acting chief administrator Derek Maltz out of retirement, and he is a prohibition warrior. So let's talk about what Schedule 3 actually means. There's a lot of misinformation floating around about this. People hear rescheduling and thinks it means full-blown legalization. It doesn't. Schedule 3 would still treat cannabis as a controlled substance, but it would acknowledge medical use and remove some of the harsher regulatory impediments to research and business. It would eliminate Section 280E tax penalties for cannabis businesses, allowing them to deduct ordinary business expenses that every other industry gets to deduct. This would be a game changer for dispensaries, cultivators, manufacturers, especially the mom and pop ones. They do exist. They're barely surviving under the current tax burden and the direct to consumer THCA hemp competitors. So don't let anyone tell you Schedule 3 is a promised land. It's not. You still wouldn't be able to freely transport cannabis across state lines because Schedule 3 drugs require FDA approval for interstate commerce. And the absence of any provision in the CSA, Controlled Substances Act, or the FDCA, Food Drug Cosmetic Act, allowing the DEA or FDA to waive this requirement means that it's unlikely that those regulators have the authority to create a new regulatory framework bypassing FDA approval. The DEA can regulate handling under the CSA, but cannot approve the sale of unapproved drugs, as that would violate the FDCA. The FDA, while having enforcement discretion, cannot legally exempt marijuana from drug approval requirements without legislative changes. So even under Schedule 3, we need legislation. And so does hemp that has CBD or THC in it. You see, the FDA has the authority to regulate hemp consumption products under the FDCA, but current laws prohibit CBD food and supplements, mostly due to the drug exclusion rule, and another rule that says you cannot put drugs in the food supply. So all those hemp beverages that are out there are really not that legal. But no one cares. The 2018 Farm Bill focuses only on production, leaving consumption regulation to the FDA, which cannot create a framework allowing CBD or THC without new legislation because of the restrictions of the FDCA. So let's keep our expectations in check, because if you really want full scale legalization, the kind where cannabis is treated more like alcohol or tobacco, you're going to have to look to Congress. And that's where things they get a little bleaker. If you've been watching this space for the past few years, you've heard of the Safe Banking Act. It's the one piece of legislation that has come closest to passing multiple times. It would provide safe harbor to financial institutions that want to work with licensed cannabis businesses. Now, this seems like a no brainer, right? Bipartisan support, public backing, economic benefits. But despite being introduced in Congress every session since 2019, it still hasn't made it to a vote in the Senate so it can reach the president's desk. Think about it. If Congress can't even pass modest reform like banking access, what are the odds they pull off something as complex and controversial as full scale cannabis regulation from CBD to THC? Let me put it this way. If safe banking is like the appetizer, legalization is the full seven-course meal, and Congress can't even get reservations to the danged restaurant. And even if Congress did decide to legalize cannabis federally tomorrow, implementation would be a bureaucratic nightmare. We're not just talking about removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. You need to rewrite significant portions of that law and the tax code, create new regulatory agencies, or empower existing ones like FDA or ATF, establish nationwide licensing and testing standards, and navigate the thicket of international drug treaties that we're party to, which we would then be violating. Oh, and you need to get all 50 states to agree on how to implement it, or at least make room for continued state control, which means we'd have a fragmented regulatory landscape, even under federal legalization. Aren't you glad you put your feet up? So, what does all this mean for you? Whether you're a business owner, an investor, or just a concerned citizen, it means that you need to stop waiting on a miracle from DC and start building your strategy around the reality on the ground. Focus on your state laws. Build a compliant operation, stay nimble and informed. And if you're in a legal market, make sure you're up to date on evolving local ordinances and state regulations. If you're in a prohibition state, start organizing. Talk to your legislators about medical cannabis. Push for reform at the local level. That's where all the momentum has come from. Medical cannabis, state and locally, not from Capitol Hill, but from city councils and state assemblies and ballot initiatives. And if you're an entrepreneur trying to survive in this industry, I get it. Welcome to the club. You're doing everything right. Securing licenses, navigating compliance, investing in technology and hiring staff, trying to build your brand, and still you are shackled by outdated federal policy and loopholes that make running your business like a joke. It's infuriating, but hopefully it's also temporary. Eventually, this house of cards should fall. The only question is when. When I think it's when we come together to regulate hemp and medical marijuana, full legalization for adult use. That might be a bridge too far before a regulatory regime is in place for CBD and THC from the cannabis plant in a safe and regulated marketplace nationwide. Look, I've been in the cannabis industry for a long time. I've seen the cycle repeat over and over. A new administration comes in, hopes rise, bills get introduced, and then nothing happens every single time. But that doesn't mean we stop pushing. It means that we need to help people in Congress introduce more than just safe banking. We need medical cannabis hemp reform to allow for human consumption, despite CBD and THC being scheduled drugs that prevent the FDA from creating regulations because of the FDCA's drug exclusion, preventing them from being either foods like drinks or dietary supplements. So we need a new bill, like the Medical Marijuana Act, which I did a video about and will put after this one. Here's my final word of advice. Deal with the world you're living in, not the one you wish that existed. And that's how real reform will come. You'll be ready to capitalize because you kept grinding for change. It does not look like it will be here anytime soon for hemp or marijuana, or just human consumption of the cannabis plant for medical, wellness, or recreational purposes, because we need congressional legislation. And no bills seem viable. But let me know in the comments if there are any pending that you like in this new Congress. I can't recall any that have been introduced except for one, continuing IRC 280E, even if marijuana is rescheduled. So absolutely no help there. And in the meantime, I hope you keep learning and stay connected to your community and support smart reform efforts. If you found this video helpful, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment about the cannabis laws in your state. I want to hear what you're dealing with on the ground. And if you're serious about launching or scaling your cannabis business, head on over to cannabisindustrylawyer.com for legal resources, consulting, and guidance from a team that's been there in the trenches. I'm Tom. This is Cannabis Legalization News. And as always, try to stay one step ahead of the lawmakers because whether they like it or not, the cannabis industry isn't going anywhere, and neither are we. Now, it's time for me to enjoy my consumption lounge.